We're over a week on from the publication of the independent Jersey Care Inquiry report. Now, the report found that children in care in Jersey suffered decades of abuse and were failed by those who should have been looking after them. Frances Oldham QC was very critical of the politicians in charge. She said that the island leaders failed to ask the right questions and were more interested in protecting the island's reputation. She said the Jersey way meant that claims of child abuse were often ignored and went amiss. Now, when the first reports of abuse started to come in back in 2007, the island's chief minister at the time was FrankWalker. Mr. Walker, what's been your reaction to the findings of the report? What did you think of them and the recommendations?
I think my reaction to the report was probably the same as just about everybody else. That spelt out in stark detail how children had been let down, to say the very least, over a considerable period of time. But I think it was a good report. I think it was very comprehensive, and I think its recommendations make a great deal of sense. And I'm delighted, I'm delighted to learn how quickly and positively Jersey Chief Minister is now reacting to those recommendations. What
do you make of the fact that she said that island leaders failed to ask the right questions and were more interested in protecting the island's reputation? She's talking about you there, effectively.
Absolutely disagree with the comment about more interested in protecting the island's reputation. That is just not true. I was horrified as Chief Minister when the revelations began to arise, absolutely horrified. I had understood from my then Health Minister and others more directly involved with Children's Services that we were in a good position. And I just couldn't believe that what we were learning and hearing was actually going on in Jersey. We had no insight into that, no forewarnings at that point whatsoever. It came as a complete and very unwelcome shock.
And how did that make you feel at the time? You know, you're boss of the island, you're in charge, and these things are going on, and you had no idea.
Sick. Absolutely sick. I visited Hodelagaren at the sort of peak of the police investigation. And what we heard there, although we now know that much of what we heard actually wasn't true from Mr. Harper, but nevertheless, my wife and I visited, and we left there feeling physically ill. And I thought
it was on your watch. Were you not asking the right questions at the time?
We had no idea that there were questions that should have been asked. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, of course, we can all see what was going on, but it was not apparent at any stage whatsoever until the whole thing started to present itself in 2007.
The report talks about a split in attitudes of politicians when the investigation began, between those who wanted to aggressively pursue abusers and those who were worried about the island's reputation. We touched on it earlier. How fair an assessment is that of what was happening at the time?
I think there were one or two isolated individuals who were questioning the support we were giving for the police investigation. I came out very, very quickly and said that no stone would be unturned in the investigation. The police would not have to be asking for money, that they would get all the money they needed to pursue the investigation, and that was supported by the vast majority of politicians, thankfully, at the time. There were one or two individuals who were questioning it. In some respects, they had a point, because we now know that quite a lot of the budget allocated to the police was actually misspent on dinners and other form of entertainment and so on. But at no time did the police get anything other than total support from me and my council of ministers.
The police came off really well in the report, though, so it's perhaps unfair to criticise them and their spending.
Well, I don't think it is unfair to criticise spending on entertainment and lavish dinners with fairly expensive bottles of wine and so on. I don't think it's wrong to criticise that at all. But at the end of the day, the police did things got pulled back under control, and the police did do a very thorough investigation, and this, of course, has resulted in numerous prosecutions subsequently, and very rightly so.
Yeah, the inquiry praised by the report. Speaking of police then, you're mentioned in the report in relation to the suspension of the former top police officer, Graham Power.
I am indeed. I'm delighted, though, that the report confirms what I've always known and most other people have always known, that his suspension had no impact on the police investigation into children's service and the abuse of children whatsoever. And I stand, whether the process of suspending him was right or not is obviously an ongoing question, but I stand by the reason for his suspension, and I would do exactly the same today. Let's be clear.
Make it clear for us. What was the reason?
Mr. Power was Chief of Police. He was in charge of the police of Jersey, he alone. Unique position. His deputy, Mr. Harper, was giving press conferences, normally at the gate of Hodelagaren, in which at various times he claimed to have found a child's skull. We now know that to be incorrect. At other times claimed that there had been up to 6 murders of children at Hodelagaren. We now know that was incorrect. And what I begged Mr. Power to do was, using his position as Chief of Police, to appear, as is common practice in the UK when there's a major investigation, to appear as Chief of Police in uniform in front of the media and give a cold, factual assessment of what was actually going on. He declined to do it, and he allowed Mr. Harper to run riot with his statements, which we now know were grossly misleading in many areas.
So did you put pressure on Deputy Andrew Lewis to suspend Graham Power?
I did not put pressure on him, but I totally agreed with him, and as I said, I would take exactly the same action today.
Now, we've glossed over it, but the report did criticise how the dismissal was handled. What would you say to that?
I'm disappointed in that. It's not the first criticism that's been made of the process. I'm disappointed because although it was Deputy Lewis's action to suspend him, I was very much involved in the process.
But he was your minister, described as inexperienced at the time, and inevitably you're the chief minister, so there must be a bit of sway involved.
I don't know if there was sway involved. We were certainly cooperating, there's absolutely no doubt about that, but we were being given top-level advice from our most senior civil servants and law officers, and both Andrew Lewis and I were utterly convinced that he was following the right procedure. Now, I think that's still an open question, but I still absolutely stand by the reasons for suspending Mr. Power, and I'm delighted, despite the conspiracy theorists, that the report has said very clearly this had no adverse effect on the investigation into childcare.
But Deputy Andrew Lewis, in all of this, has come off quite badly, and the report says that he lied. Was Deputy Lewis therefore a scapegoat? Was it really your decision to suspend Graham Power?
It was not my decision. It was a joint decision, but I fully put my hand up to my part in it, and I've said I would take exactly the same decision today. The decision was taken on the best advice available, and I'm surprised and saddened that Deputy Lewis seems to have got himself into a bit of a hole in terms of what he has said to the States and, by the sound of it, to the care inquiry.
Now, we should say that Deputy Lewis vehemently denies.
It was the right decision.
Any regrets about how things were handled? As I said, the report criticised the dismissal and the sort of circumstances surrounding it.
I think it's a sideshow. The fact is, it's children we should be worried about here, and the report has reiterated that his suspension had no adverse impact on the police investigation of child abuse. That's what we should be focused on. We should be focusing on what went wrong, which we, as far as children are concerned, which we clearly are, and we should be focusing on what we must do now to ensure nothing like that ever happens again, which the Chief Minister and his team are most evidently doing.
We have a recording of you from back then saying that Stuart Sivray, who was telling you about the abuse, child abuse in in the island was trying to ruin Jersey's reputation. So therefore, you were concerned at the time about the impact it would have.
If you weren't there at the time, Ashley, that report was taken completely out of context, and the BBC, this was the subject of a Newsnight interview for which the BBC had to apologise profusely a year later, saying they'd misrepresented my view, they'd misled the public, and it was one of the most abject apologies I've ever seen from the BBC. I never, ever said that I put Jersey's reputation ahead of childcare. Stuart Sivray was then, and is still trying today, to rewrite history. He has much to answer for here. He was President of the Health Committee and Health Minister for 8 years while all this child abuse was actually going on.
Now, Keir,
and never at any point did he at that time raise the alarm. Never at any point, and he and I had many individual one-on-one discussions about health. Never at any time did he say to me, Frank, we've got a problem with children.
Now, of course, Stuart Sivray isn't here to respond to that comment, but I have to ask you, do you feel like this investigation and the inquiry has perhaps tarnished a long political career for you?
Mine?
Yours?
No, I don't. It was me who initiated the Williamson inquiry, which we acted upon, and it was me who called, as soon as we knew how serious this was, it was me who called for the setting up of the public inquiry. And I'm delighted that I did, and delighted not with the findings because they're incredibly painful, but delighted that it has resulted in such a thorough investigation of what went wrong and many very good recommendations on what we need to do from now.
Do you admit that perhaps things could have been changed for the better sooner? You know, we had reports out suggesting that the Jersey way wasn't the way forward. The Jersey Care Inquiry last week saying children are still at risk, almost 10 years on from the original investigation from Operation Rectangle. Do you admit that things perhaps could have been changing sooner than what they are in your tenure?
In my tenure, with the benefit of hindsight, and by goodness me, we've all got that, yes, of course, had we known what was going on, had we had any inkling of what was going on, we'd have done things very differently. As it was, we commissioned Williamson, and let's not forget, Andrew Williamson was one of Britain's leading childcare specialists. He was recommended to us by the UK government. He did what we thought then, and in fairness to him, I think was a thorough review that made recommendations which we acted upon.
But clearly there's still children at risk, so they can't have been acted on fully.
We now know those recommendations didn't go far enough, but I would defy anyone not to believe that one of Britain's top childcare commissioners knew what he was talking about when he presented that report, and there were uncomfortable revelations in that report, but we acted upon them straight away.
Finally, before we run out of time, what do you think we should do as a community to heal, to move on, and to recognise those who did suffer abuse at the hands of Jersey's care system in the island?
Well, I think it's happening, I think we all need to be utterly determined and signed up to that determination to ensure that children are no longer at risk and this can never happen again. And to that end, the recommendations of the inquiry, I think, I hope they cover that comprehensively. And I have no doubt, having listened to the Chief Minister and read his comments, that that's what we're going to do. We will meet those recommendations, and children... You can never, ever, in any community, say that children would not be at risk, and this has been proven worldwide. What we've got to do is ensure that in Jersey, our children are at the least possible risk, and I believe that's what's now happening.
FrankWalker, thank you for your time this morning. He was the island's first ever Chief Minister and held the position as the Jersey Care investigation was in its early stages. Just coming up to 10 minutes to 9 o'clock now on Good Morning Jersey. On the way